Welcome back. Joining me today is Dr. Daniel Kavish. Daniel is an assistant professor of sociology and criminal justice based in the United States. He's also a ferret enthusiast, evidenced by his Twitter handle, CrimFerret. Daniel is an expert on labeling theory, which is the topic of today's conversation. He and I go way back. In fact, we went to high school together for a time in Springfield, Illinois. So first things first, what do you miss more, pieces of candy or a good old-fashioned horseshoe?
Horseshoes, definitely.
No debate. So let's get to it. What exactly is labeling?
So, labeling is the process by which formal labels are applied to individuals discovered to have engaged in delinquency. Formal labels being typically viewed as arrests or convictions. These labels, in turn, might influence subsequent crime and delinquency through a change in that person's identity or blocking future opportunities or blocking access to pro-social groups in the future.
Okay, so do labels have to be formal or can there be informal labels too?
We typically break them down into formal and informal. The formal labels are applied by individuals with the official authority to label an individual. So in this case, we're typically talking educational systems or correctional systems. Informal labels are people that don't have that professional authority. So typically we're talking other adults or parents, a parent thinking their child has a bad temper, things of that nature.
So to summarize it, labeling theory asserts that identity plays a major role in delinquency and criminal involvement over time, and that these labels aid in terms of creating these identities.
Correct. So the idea is rooted in symbolic interactionism, in that the label might kick off a self-fulfilling prophecy where by labeling someone deviant, they slowly or inevitably come to view themselves as deviant themselves.
Okay, so who kicked off this idea?
I like to think that we can trace it back to Charles Cooley in 1902 when he presented his idea of the looking glass self.
Geez, that's like old-timey Vermeer. Is that what he's talking about?
Yeah. So Cooley believed that an individual's view of self was formed depending on how they thought others viewed them. So how an individual reacts to other people's perceptions. So effectively, picture yourself in a mirror, and when you are getting ready in the morning and you're looking at your hair, you aren't necessarily thinking about it at a very conscious level, but ultimately when we're doing our hair, I'm doing it like thinking about how others will view me, and that thought process will then influence how I behave, how I decide to do my hair that day.
Now, a little while ago, you were talking about symbolic interactionalism. That came after this. What was that, and who was talking about that?
George Herbert Mead in the 1930s presented this idea of symbolic interactionism, which effectively was a richer and more specific model of what Cooley presented with the looking glass self. And this is the idea that actions are influenced by our identity, and that individuals construct shared meanings and understandings through the process of social interaction.
So this is very different compared to what those classical criminologists like Beccaria and Bentham were talking about, right?
Oh, very much so. So Beccaria and Bentham are looking at the self or identity as static and relatively unchanging over time, whereas labeling theorists will argue that the self is dynamic and is effectively in flux throughout your life course.
Okay, I see. But you're talking about some people who were existing almost 100 years ago or more in Cooley's case. How much currency has labeling theory had over time? What happened after those guys put their ideas out there?
So in the late 1930s, so not long after Mead, fleshed out symbolic interactionism, Frank Tannenbaum, a criminologist, is commonly brought up as arguably one of the originators of labeling theory as we know it in criminology when he presented the idea of the dramatization of evil. And he described this as a process by which offenders acquire deviant labels from members of society. Effectively, if an act is characterized as evil by society, then the offender will be simultaneously associated with the act and labeled as deviant or evil.
Okay, but Tannenbaum, you're still talking about before World War II. So what happened after that? Are we still talking about labels?
In the 50s and 60s, three scholars within criminology and sociology effectively began dominating criminological literature: Lemert, Becker, and Skur. And they wrote a series of books, and they were popular because they offered an alternative to deterrence theory, which is Beccaria and Bentham, like we spoke of earlier. And each of them asserted, for various reasons, that individuals will engage in deviant or delinquent behavior, and then some, but not all, of those individuals will get labeled. And once formally or informally labeled, this will create a process where their identity might change and then drive future deviant acts.
Okay, let me ask you a question here. I'm a little bit confused. Who exactly is creating these labels? You said before these were people in positions of authority. I get that. And the people who are doing something that are deviant are being labeled. But who is the audience for these labels? Like, surely somebody who's being labeled isn't the only audience.
So effectively, the labels are created by people in power or moral entrepreneurs, people that are wanting to criminalize some type of behavior that they have deemed deviant. So effectively, what is deviant is that which someone in power has said is deviant, criminally deviant. So, in more general terms, this is labeling theory's conflict tradition, in that the least powerful members of society are the individuals that are most susceptible to labeling. So, lower class individuals and racial minorities are more likely than others to have those labels applied to them through the selective enforcement of the laws that are created by lawmakers.
You mentioned this term moral entrepreneur earlier. What exactly is a moral entrepreneur? That sounds kind of like a religious body.
No. So it's simply put, it's a term coined by Howard Becker in 1963, and it's people who make decisions in terms of what is right and wrong in society. So effectively, it's people with power.
How do they go about thinking about rule breaking?
So rules are created by social groups, and it's the infraction of these rules that creates deviance. The rules are applied to people, and labeling theorists argue that they are selectively applied. So people in power, the moral entrepreneurs that make these rules, are then going to apply them in a conflict tradition, is how labeling theory sees it, where those laws will then be applied to people more susceptible to that power, which would be racial minorities or lower income, lower class individuals. Effectively, people with less political power in society is who labeling theorists would argue are more susceptible to those labels.
Okay, so if you're labeled as an outsider, another way to think of that is that you're stigmatized, right?
Correct. So stigma can be described as an experience of moving through life with an attribute that is deeply discrediting. And if you've been labeled, you have effectively been stigmatized. And this is where we go back to those old dead theorists from the early 1900s. And that's why identity is essential when we talk about labeling theory, because those labels stigmatize you and can create what we sometimes call a spoiled identity, which is just an identity that is experiencing or has experienced stigma.
So, how do people go through life managing a spoiled identity?
So there's lots of different ways. One way we can look at it is there are many different stigma management strategies. So in terms of a felony conviction as a label, you could try disclosing your criminal background during the interview process, being very open and honest, and hoping that speaking in earnest can earn you some sympathy or a second chance, but essentially trying to explain it away. Another way of managing stigma is through what we call sometimes personal vouchers. And it's not as fancy as it sounds. It's effectively developing relationships with people that might have more influence or power than you, and getting them to vouch for you. No, that's a good, he's a good guy. You should hire him.
So, what you're kind of describing is the need for a lot of people with spoiled identities to rely on favors from other people. I think Reuben Miller talks about this in his book.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. You definitely can become dependent on people vouching for you, and it's situational. So when we say someone powerful or with influence, it could be, having someone a previous employer that is able to talk to the next employer and say he was a really good hire, you should give him a chance. Or maybe the mayor of the city, and the mayor can vouch for you. But yeah, you become dependent on other people vouching for your character effectively. So another stigma strategy would be emphasizing your identity in a different way. So effectively, you could say, well, yeah, I have a felony conviction, but I'm not like other felons. I've done this, this, and this. I've gone and I go to school and I haven't gotten in any more trouble. And you start trying to separate yourself from what people have in their head stereotypically when they think of, quote, a felon.
Okay, but certainly when folks step out of line, broader society wants them to know that. Is spoiling somebody's identity the only real way to achieve that?
So far, what we've been talking about when we mention labeling, we could describe as disintegrative shaming, which is effectively shaming that stigmatizes and excludes the person being shamed. So the process is identified or implied in the bulk of labeling theory literature, and effectively society is labeling both the acts and the actors. So the behaviors that are being engaged in are dramatized as evil, as Tannenbaum would speak, and the people engaged in those acts are dramatized as evil. However, Braithwaite in the late 1980s said that we could engage in what's called reintegrative shaming, which would be still social disapproval. So, a process where society is disapproving of that behavior, but it's followed by a process that actually seeks to reintegrate the person that engaged in that behavior back into the community. So, they broke the law, but we want to shame the breaking of that law, but then we want to encourage them to come back into the fold, so to speak, and be a law-abiding citizen.
That's kind of like having somebody have redemption, which is a big theme in what we see in television and which resonates with a large part of the population. I think Shad Maruna called making good?
Yeah. So when we talk about making good, we can say that we're talking about redemption narratives. If we want to reintegrate people back into society, there needs to be a narrative of redemption, or possibly even a reintegrative ceremony. So we could say that getting an executive pardon from a governor or the president would be a good example of a redemption ceremony. Expungements, because these are effectively processes that are engaged in, oversaw by those official authorities that are representatives of the part of society that labeled you as deviant. And so if them, as the executives of a particular government and representatives of that society, then say, you're all good now, you're pardoned, or this has been expunged, it's in a way a type of ritual or ceremony saying that you have redeemed yourself. You are now a functioning full member of society again.
So, to sum up, labeling theory's focus is on the experience of being labeled, right? How does that work in practice? Can you give me an example?
Well, I can give myself as an example. My junior year of high school, I was discovered to have a knife at the bottom of my book bag. And this was shortly after Columbine, when a lot of schools had initiated a lot of zero tolerance policies. Simply finding that knife in my book bag resulted in schools kicking me out. So I was expelled from school. And the school board has the official authority to make that decision. And so, in the school's eyes, I had done something deviant enough to be labeled a deviant and expelled from the school.
Okay, so just to use the language that you've taught us so far. So, in this case, it would be the school board acting as the moral entrepreneurs who are setting a zero tolerance policy and then labeling you as a deviant by expelling you from school and forcing you to take on some alternative education.
Correct. That perfectly sums it up. The expulsion is the sanction, and the sanction is the label.
Okay, and how did that label impact you for the rest of high school?
So, well, I had to go to an alternative school, as they say, which was a school filled with other people that had been labeled deviant from across the city for various reasons. And we had to petition to get back into school. But ultimately, it brought a lot of attention. So everybody was always worried about me getting into trouble. It changed how people viewed me. When I came back to school, it was as if I was some bad boy stepping back on campus. And the thing is, even if that wasn't how people felt, because of possibly a change in my identity, that's how I felt at the time. That I felt I was coming back into this environment where people thought of me differently.
One of the things that you mentioned that I want to explore a little bit more is the way that labels exclude people from opportunities. When I was interviewing people who had been released from prison, they said that their felon status kept them from getting jobs. Is this part of the labeling process too?
Yes. So labeling theory asserts that there's effectively three what we call intervening mechanisms that will influence future delinquency or involvement in crime. One we've covered is that change in identity, that potential change in identity. And the second would be blocked access to mainstream opportunities. And the third one would be blocked access to pro social groups. So, for instance, a famous sociologist named Diva Pager actually looked into this and showed that the effect of a criminal record on employment was extremely significant, but also that it was more pronounced in some people than others. So, in fact, white people with criminal records received much more favorable treatment than black people with criminal records.
And didn't she also find that white people with criminal records received more favorable treatment than even black people without criminal records?
Yes, that's correct. So she found that even when a white person had a criminal record, they were still more likely to get favorable treatment than a black person that did not have a record at all.
So this goes back to you talking about how labels are applied in different ways. So you can have the same label for the same action being applied in distinct ways. And it's a crazy thing to think about, but it's not surprising to anyone who's worked at a grade school, I suspect. We know that there's a phenomenon called the school to prison pipeline, and the majority of the young people who are in that pipeline are children of color. Uh, can you explain what that pipeline is and how it works?
In our example earlier, we talked about how I got in trouble at school, and I was at school, and it was a school policy that led me to get in trouble, and that was actually handled by a school resource officer. So I was officially arrested. It was a paper arrest, but effectively I was labeled, I was sanctioned, and it all was because of school policies and rules. Had I not been at school, I probably wouldn't have been arrested for having a knife in my book bag that I used for my job. Effectively, labeling theory would say that that process is the beginning of that school to prison pipeline. So once you're labeled, we are starting this cycle where potentially you are being removed from pro-social groups, or your identity changes, or you lose out on future opportunities, which just only serves to reinforce that deviant identity. One could argue it could turn into a vicious cycle where that if you don't have access to mainstream opportunities, and you don't have access to pro-social groups, and your identity changes to start seeing yourself as deviant, you might start associating with people that aren't pro-social. You might go and start hanging out with a gang, or find a group of other friends that like breaking the rules.
Okay, you mentioned that this was the beginning of the school to prison pipeline, but you ended up in that alternative school. You ended up having a pretty normal life, but I know that a lot of the people who ended up at that school didn't. Why was that?
So I had to rely on personal vouchers, and I had to fight for what you could say are second chances, but I was able to convince an employer to hire me, and I worked hard while I was at school to where I was able to eventually convince the school board to let me back into a normal high school. But it didn't work out like that for everyone, especially when we fast forward and look at things in a more of a life course perspective, and see that some of these kids never graduated, and it could have been putting them in this alternative environment that was not well suited for teaching contributed to that. And many of them ended up getting in more and more trouble. There were multiple police officers at this school, so it just created more opportunities for subsequent behaviors to be identified by law enforcement, which creates more opportunities for more labeling. And it was a process that was hard to avoid. Out of the people I was there with, I only know of one other individual that even went on to college. And I know of quite a few that were arrested as adults for other behaviors.
Yeah, and we certainly knew people in high school who ended up in the Department of Corrections before we graduated. Going back to your example, you got in trouble for having the knife at school. Sometimes we see folks really overreacting to issues or problems. Some sociologists have called this deviancy amplification. What exactly is that?
So this is the idea where we're amplifying a problem to be bigger than what it really is. And effectively, we might be creating a cycle of deviancy. So, two of the more notorious amplifications that we've seen, you can actually look at these as what we call moral panics. So, one would be the satanic panic. In the 80s, a lot of parents were worried about these kids that were playing Dungeons and Dragons. And there was this moral panic where moral entrepreneurs were trying to promote the idea that Dungeons and Dragons was some form of pseudo devil worship. And there's even a movie starring Tom Hanks where he plays this character that falls into this fantasy that he can control, he has magical weapons and has magical skills and uh, has lost touch with reality. Whereas hopefully today most of us realize that Dungeons and Dragons is a game of people sitting around a table having fun, rolling dice and pretending, using their imagination. But initially there was a lot of people that tried to associate playing Dungeons and Dragons with Satan worship.
Yeah, and it's hysterical, right? Because actually, people who are playing Dungeons and Dragons are most likely going to be staying out of trouble. They're doing a very pro-social activity with their friends and, not getting into any kind of mischief that would get them into actual trouble with the law.
I don't know if irony is the right word, but it was my junior year after getting kicked out that I actually went down to a comic book shop and started playing Dungeons and Dragons with a group of friends there. So very pro social activity. Maybe Dungeons and Dragons got me out of the school to prison pipeline.
Okay, so getting back to labels, we seem to understand that labels do have a lot of negative consequences for people, right?
Yeah, so once someone's been deemed deviant by society or deemed to be bad, the common view is that that person is permanently bad. And that's what Tannenbaum meant by this dramatization of evil. The act gets associated with the individual, and both of them are viewed as bad. So the processes and means of social control that are intended to induce law abiding behavior or conformity can have the unintended consequence of actually doing the opposite and promoting subsequent and more deviant behavior. So, the key point from a labeling perspective is that some individuals might internalize these labels, these criminal labels, and embrace that identity. At one point, they would argue that this might initiate a pathway into a deviant or criminal career. I'd argue that while this is a key focal aspect of labeling theory, that many of the critics of labeling theory have put too much emphasis on identity, and that we need to start considering the blocked opportunities and the blocked access to pro-social groups. Those were always a part of labeling theory and that perspective, but it seems like many of the critics have only focused on the identity aspect of things, that while important and while the focal point of labeling theory, there are these other two hypotheses that tend to be ignored by critics.
Okay, so you've talked about the critics. What are their critiques? And if we're just being honest about labeling theory, what are some of its shortcomings?
Edwin Lemert was another one of those labeling theorists from the 60s that argued, 50s, 60s, that argued that there were two types of deviance. There was primary deviance and secondary deviance. Effectively, secondary deviance was the deviance that takes place after being labeled. And so, one of what I would argue to be the strongest critiques of labeling theory is that it's heavily focused on explaining secondary deviance, which effectively means it's not as good at explaining primary deviance. If the core argument is that formal labels predict subsequent delinquency, then it's not doing as good of a job. Like, how does it explain the deviance that eventually got you that formal label? And that's where the informal labels come into play. When we start talking about, parents and friends and family members that are informally labeling a kid as having a bad temper or argumentative, some type of negative attribute, and that possibly they internalize that, and that leads to the early delinquency. While there is some empirical support for that, that I would argue is the weaker aspect of labeling theory, is that it's not doing a good job of explaining that primary deviance.
All right, thanks for that. Now, one of the things that we have learned about is that policymakers are the moral entrepreneurs who establish labels, and they put these labels on all sorts of people, and these labels can have damaging consequences. If you were king of the world, what would you change in order to improve how society functions in this process of labeling and stigmatizing and the rest of it?
So I think what I would do is expand the use of a few things that already exist in society. But going back to Braithwaite and Maruna talking about reintegrative shaming and redemption narratives, what I would change is giving more opportunities to have a clean slate, so to speak. So right now, if you have a felony conviction on your record, in some places, your only options are to seek out an expungement, which there's lots of rules and it varies from state to state on if you qualify, or an executive pardon, which, if it's a federal crime, would have to come from the president, or a state crime, the governor. And that is your only means of in many places of getting a clean slate. But there are other options. So there is actually clean slate laws that in some states we've legislated a timeline of when you get your rights back, and when your record will no longer show up when you apply for jobs, things like that. I'm a big proponent of deferred adjudication programs for first time offenders and for many different types of offenses and situations where we can. So let's say we are going to give people probation, or that's what we've been doing for a certain type of crime. Well, we could still do the probation, but why not have a clause in the probation documents that say, if you successfully complete your probation, this won't go on your criminal record, or it will be removed from your permanent record. So that way, not only are you having an opportunity to have a clean slate, but you can also look at it as incentivizing conformity, incentivizing following the rules, because now you have a goal to aim for, and that achieving that goal could be looked at as a redemption ritual or a redemption ceremony. So effectively, if to put it simply, delabeling processes. If we have these labeling processes happening that are stigmatizing people, then we potentially need to consider how we can delabel those people and destigmatize those people. They provide opportunities for, if we want to call it redemption, or to earn a second chance or a clean slate. People in America like to talk about second chances, but there really isn't a real second chance when you can't get certain jobs or you're being excluded from certain groups.
Danny, thanks so much for joining me today and sharing all of your knowledge on labeling and its impacts on people.
Oh, thank you.